My neighbor's husband kept flirting with me. When we confronted him, his wife called us liars. A year later, he's in prison and you won't believe why. I, Emma, 28F, never imagined I'd be sharing this story, but I need advice on a situation that's slowly unraveling my life. My husband Richard, 30M, and I have been married for 3 years now, together for 8. We met in college. I was a sophomore studying psychology, and he was a senior majoring in engineering. It wasn't love at first sight or anything movie-worthy. We were lab partners in a general education course, and over the semester, our friendship grew into something more. Richard has always been my rock. He's patient, kind, and has this dry sense of humor that never fails to make me laugh. We dated for 5 years before getting married, taking our time to make sure we were truly ready for that commitment. Our wedding was small but perfect, just close family and friends in Richard's parents' backyard. We honeymooned in Hawaii, a trip we had saved up for during our entire engagement. After the wedding, we lived in a small apartment in the city. Richard worked as a mechanical engineer at a local firm, while I finished my master's degree in counseling. We were happy but cramped. We'd often joke about needing to schedule time in the bathroom because it was so tiny. Still, it was ours, and we made it work. Last year, an opportunity came up that we couldn't pass up. Richard's company offered him a promotion, but it required relocating to a suburban area about an hour away from the city. The pay increase was substantial, and the cost of living was lower. After many late-night discussions and pros/con lists, Richard's engineering mind at work, we decided to take the plunge. We found a beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood called Maple Grove. It was more than we ever dreamed we could afford, a 2-story home with a big backyard and a garage large enough for Richard to tinker with his beloved vintage Mustang. The previous owners had maintained a beautiful garden, which excited me as I'd always wanted to try my hand at gardening but never had the space in our apartment. Moving day was chaotic but fun. Richard's college buddies came to help, and we ended the day with pizza and beer on our new patio furniture. As we sat there, watching the sunset over our new neighborhood, I remember feeling so content. This was the beginning of our next chapter. The next day, as we were unpacking, our next-door neighbors came over to introduce themselves. George, 35M, and Sharon, 33F, Miller seemed nice enough. They brought over a homemade apple pie and offered to show us around the neighborhood. They had 2 kids, Mary, 7F, and Max, 5M, who were shy at first but quickly warmed up to us when they discovered Richard could do magic tricks. George worked in finance and Sharon was a part-time yoga instructor. They'd lived in Maple Grove for nearly a decade and knew everyone. They even offered to host a small get-together to introduce us to other neighbors. We were touched by their kindness and accepted gratefully. The get-together was a success. We met several other couples around our age and felt welcomed into the community. Mark, 40M, and Nancy, 38F, from across the street were particularly friendly. Mark was a high school teacher, and Nancy ran a small bakery in town. They didn't have kids but doted on their 2 golden retrievers. For the first few months, everything was perfect. Richard settled into his new role at work, often coming home excited about the projects he was working on. I found a job at a local counseling center, helping teenagers with anxiety and depression. On weekends, we'd explore our new town or work on house projects together. We became closer with the Millers. Our dogs, our corgi, Bentley, and their Labrador, Cooper, would play in the shared backyard. Richard and George bonded over their shared love for vintage cars. George had a classic Chevrolet that he was restoring, and the two would spend hours discussing engines and paint jobs. Sharon and I discovered we both enjoyed gardening. She taught me how to care for the plants the previous owners had left behind and helped me start my own vegetable patch. We'd often spend Saturday mornings working in our gardens, chatting over the fence that separated our yards. However, things started to change about 6 months ago. I began noticing George acting differently around me. It was subtle at first, lingering glances, standing a bit too close when we talked, finding excuses to come over when Richard wasn't around. I brushed it off initially, thinking maybe I was reading too much into things. After all, I'm a counselor, I'm trained to notice behavioral changes, and sometimes I worry I overanalyze. But as time went on, George's behavior became more obvious. He started sending me text messages, asking how my day was going or if I needed any help around the house. Once, when Richard was out of town for a work conference, George showed up at our door with a bottle of wine, claiming Sharon was out with friends and he thought I might like some company. I politely declined, feeling uncomfortable with the situation. I didn't tell Richard about these incidents at first. I didn't want to create tension with our neighbors, especially when Sharon had been so kind to me. Plus, Richard and George had become good friends, often working on their cars together or watching sports games. I told myself I was probably overreacting and tried to avoid being alone with George. The breaking point came during our neighborhood's annual summer festival last month. It's a big event in Maple Grove. The whole community comes together for a day of food, games, and a fireworks display at night. Richard had to work late that day. His team was up against a big deadline, so I went alone, promising to save him some of Mark and Nancy's famous barbecue ribs. George approached me almost immediately, offering me a drink and sticking by my side for most of the evening. As the night wore on and more alcohol flowed, George became bolder. He put his arm around my waist while we were talking to other neighbors, and at one point, he leaned in and whispered that I looked beautiful. I was shocked and pulled away, making an excuse about needing to check on something at home. I left the festival early, my mind reeling. When I got home, I told Richard everything, about the text messages, the wine incident, and what had happened at the festival. He was furious and wanted to confront George right away, but I convinced him to wait until we had cooled down and could approach the situation rationally. The next day, Richard and I decided to talk to George and Sharon together. We invited them over, thinking it would be best to address the issue openly and honestly. But what happened next left us both stunned. When we explained the situation to Sharon, instead of being upset with George, she laughed it off. She said George was just a friendly guy and that I must have misinterpreted his actions. George denied everything, claiming I was the one who had been flirting with him. He even went so far as to suggest that maybe I was unhappy in my marriage and projecting my feelings onto him. Richard defended me vehemently, but George and Sharon seemed to have a united front. They accused us of trying to create drama in the neighborhood and threatened to tell everyone that we were causing problems. The conversation ended with them storming out of our house, leaving Richard and me in disbelief. Now, we're at a loss. Our once friendly neighborhood feels hostile. We've heard whispers that George and Sharon have been spreading rumors about us to other neighbors. Some people have stopped talking to us altogether. Richard suggested we consider moving, but we love our house and don't feel we should have to leave because of someone else's inappropriate behavior. I feel violated and angry, not just at George's actions, but at Sharon's dismissal of my concerns and their joint attempt to turn the situation around on us. Richard is supportive, but I can tell he's frustrated and unsure of what to do next. This house was supposed to be the start of our future together, and now it feels tainted. We're considering reaching out to other neighbors to explain our side of the story, but we're worried about escalating the situation. Should we stand our ground or cut our losses and move? How do we navigate this complex situation without letting it tear apart our life in this neighborhood we once loved? Update 1. It's been about a month since my last post, and I want to thank everyone for their advice and support. Your words have been a source of strength for Richard and me as we've navigated this difficult situation. After much discussion, Richard and I decided to stand our ground. We realized that moving would feel like admitting guilt, and we hadn't done anything wrong. Instead, we chose to be proactive about addressing the situation in our neighborhood. We started by reaching out to Mark and Nancy, the couple from across the street. We had always gotten along well with them, often sharing meals or having game nights together. We invited them over for dinner, promising to explain why we'd been so distant lately. The evening of the dinner, I was a bundle of nerves. I spent hours cleaning the house and preparing the meal, a lasagna recipe passed down from my grandmother. Richard tried to calm me down, reminding me that Mark and Nancy were our friends and would listen with an open mind. When Mark and Nancy arrived, we made small talk over appetizers. But as we sat down to dinner, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I burst into tears, the stress of the past few weeks finally overwhelming me. Through my sobs, I explained everything that had happened with George and Sharon. To our immense relief, Mark and Nancy were incredibly supportive. They revealed that they had noticed George's behavior towards other women in the neighborhood and had always found it a bit off-putting. Nancy shared that George had made her uncomfortable at a neighborhood barbecue last year, standing too close and making suggestive comments. She hadn't said anything at the time, not wanting to create drama. Mark and Nancy encouraged us to speak to other neighbors. They assured us that not everyone was buying into George and Sharon's version of events. In fact, they suggested that our silence might be allowing George and Sharon's rumors to gain traction. Emboldened by their support, we decided to host a neighborhood potluck. We invited everyone on our street, including George and Sharon. Our plan was to address the elephant in the room in a public setting, hoping that the presence of others would encourage honesty and prevent further manipulation. The week leading up to the potluck was tense. We received a mix of responses to our invitation. Some neighbors accepted enthusiastically, while others made excuses about prior commitments. George and Sharon didn't respond at all, leaving us unsure if they would show up. The day of the potluck arrived. Richard and I spent the morning preparing our backyard, setting up tables and chairs, stringing up lights. I made my mom's famous potato salad and Richard fired up the grill for burgers and hot dogs. To our surprise, almost everyone showed up, even George and Sharon. The atmosphere was tense at first, with people clearly unsure of how to act around us. Richard and I did our best to be warm and welcoming, which seemed to put most of our neighbors at ease. About halfway through the evening, I stood up and addressed everyone. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. I calmly explained what had been happening with George, how Sharon had dismissed my concerns, and how they had then spread rumors about us. I made it clear that we valued our place in the community and wanted to clear the air. The reaction was mixed. Some neighbors looked uncomfortable, while others nodded in understanding. George and Sharon sat stone-faced throughout my speech. When I finished, I invited anyone with questions or concerns to speak up. What happened next was unexpected. Rachel, 45F, who lived 2 houses down from us, stood up. With a shaky voice, she said that George had made similar advances towards her last year, but she had been too embarrassed to say anything. Her husband, Dave, 47M, looked shocked. Apparently, she hadn't told him either. This revelation seemed to open the floodgates. 2 other women came forward with similar stories about George's inappropriate behavior. Sharon sat there, her face growing redder by the minute. George tried to defend himself, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but it was clear that no one was buying it anymore. The evening ended with George and Sharon leaving early, and the rest of the neighbors staying to talk. Many apologized to us for believing the rumors, and there was a general sense of relief that the truth had finally come out. In the days that followed, we received numerous messages of support from our neighbors. George and Sharon have been noticeably absent from neighborhood activities, and we've heard through the grapevine that they're considering moving. While the situation isn't entirely resolved, Richard and I feel much better. We're glad we decided to face the problem head-on instead of running away from it. Our relationships with our other neighbors have actually grown stronger through this ordeal. We're still processing everything that's happened, but we're cautiously optimistic about the future. The neighborhood feels different now. There's a sense of unity that wasn't there before. People are making more of an effort to check in on each other and spend time together. Richard and I have started hosting a weekly game night, alternating houses with Mark and Nancy. It's become a neighborhood event, with different people joining each week. Last Friday, we had so many people that we had to set up tables in the backyard. As for George and Sharon, we haven't seen much of them. They keep to themselves now, only leaving their house when necessary. Part of me feels bad for them, especially their kids who don't understand why they can't play with the other neighborhood children anymore. But then I remind myself of all the pain they caused and the trust they broke. We're taking it one day at a time, focusing on rebuilding our life here and strengthening our relationships with our neighbors. It's not always easy, but we're getting there. We'll keep you updated if anything else significant occurs. Update 2. It's been 2 months since my last update, and the situation has taken some unexpected turns. I apologize for the delay in posting. Things have been hectic, to say the least. Shortly after our neighborhood potluck, George and Sharon put their house up for sale. They didn't speak to anyone about it, just quietly listed the property. Most of the neighbors were relieved, thinking this would be the end of the drama. Richard and I felt a mix of emotions, relief that we wouldn't have to deal with them anymore, but also frustration that they were leaving without ever really acknowledging the harm they'd caused. Life in the neighborhood started to return to normal. Our weekly game nights continued to be a hit, and we even started a book club that met once a month. It felt like we were finally settling into the community life we had dreamed of when we first moved here. But about 3 weeks ago, as Richard and I were having breakfast on a quiet Sunday morning, we heard a commotion outside. We looked out to see police cars parked in front of George and Sharon's house. Curious and concerned, we went outside, joining other neighbors who had gathered to watch. To our shock, we saw George being led out of the house in handcuffs. Sharon followed, crying and yelling at the officers. Their kids were nowhere to be seen, which was a small mercy. None of us knew what was happening, but rumors started flying immediately. It wasn't until the next day that we learned the truth, and it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. George had been arrested on charges of embezzlement from his company. Apparently, he'd been stealing money for years to fund a lavish lifestyle that he and Sharon couldn't actually afford. This revelation put everything into a new perspective. George's aggressive flirting, Sharon's dismissal of other women's concerns, it all seemed like a smokescreen now, a way to distract from their real issues. The fallout was intense. Sharon and their kids moved out of the house within a week, presumably to stay with family. The house has been seized as part of the investigation into George's crimes. Our once quiet street has been buzzing with activity. Police, lawyers, and even local news vans have been a common sight. Richard and I have been trying to process this information. On one hand, we feel vindicated. George's true character has been revealed, and it's clear that his inappropriate behavior towards me and other women was just the tip of the iceberg. On the other hand, we feel a deep sadness for George and Sharon's children, who are innocent victims in all of this. The neighborhood has rallied together in the wake of this scandal. We've had several community meetings to discuss how we can support each other and move forward. There's been talk of setting up a neighborhood watch program and organizing more regular community events to strengthen our bonds. Personally, this whole experience has been a roller coaster. Richard and I are relieved that George is gone, but we're also dealing with a sense of guilt. Could we have somehow seen the bigger picture? Could we have done something to prevent this? Rationally, we know it's not our fault, but it's hard not to second-guess ourselves. We're focusing on healing now, both as a couple and as part of our community. We're grateful for the support of our neighbors and are committed to helping rebuild the trust that was broken. As for George and Sharon, we've heard that George is awaiting trial and Sharon has filed for divorce. It's a sad end to what once seemed like a perfect family life. We'll keep you updated if there are any more developments, but for now, we're just taking it one day at a time and trying to find our new normal in the aftermath of all this chaos. Update 3. It's been 6 months since my last update, and I wanted to share some final thoughts on this whole situation. George's trial concluded last month. He was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Sharon testified against him, revealing that she had been unaware of the embezzlement. She claimed that George had gaslighted her for years, making her doubt her own perceptions, including the concerns raised by me and other women in the neighborhood. While it doesn't excuse her actions, it did help us understand her perspective a bit better. Sharon and the kids moved away shortly after the trial. Before leaving, she came to our house to apologize. It was a difficult conversation, filled with tears and regrets. She admitted that she had ignored the signs of George's inappropriate behavior because she was desperately trying to keep her family together. We didn't become best friends or anything, but we did reach a place of understanding. Our neighborhood has undergone a significant transformation. The experience has brought us all closer together. We now have monthly community meetings where we discuss everything from local issues to planning social events. We've started several initiatives, including a neighborhood watch program and a community garden. The community garden has been a particularly healing project. We converted an unused lot at the end of our street into a beautiful space filled with vegetables, flowers, and even a small orchard. It's become a place where neighbors gather to work together, share stories, and heal from the past year's events. I often find myself there, tending to the tomatoes or chatting with Nancy about her latest baking adventures. Richard and I have grown stronger through this ordeal. We've learned the importance of open communication and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. We've also learned not to take our relationships, with each other and with our community, for granted. Our careers have taken some interesting turns too. Richard's company recognized his leadership during the difficult times in our neighborhood and promoted him to a management position. As for me, my experiences inspired me to shift my counseling focus. I now specialize in helping people who have been victims of manipulation and gaslighting. It's challenging work, but incredibly rewarding. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed in just over a year. What started as a simple neighborly dispute unveiled a web of lies, crime, and broken trust. It's been a harsh reminder that you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. We're moving forward now, focusing on the positive changes that have come out of this difficult time. Our neighborhood feels more united than ever, and we're committed to maintaining that sense of community. Last weekend, we had our first annual Maple Grove Festival, a day of food, games, and music that ended with a beautiful lantern release. As I watched the lanterns float into the night sky, each carrying a neighbor's hope or wish for the future, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. As for us, Richard and I are doing well. We've decided to renew our wedding vows next month, a celebration of our love and resilience in the face of adversity. Many of our neighbors will be there to celebrate with us. We're holding the ceremony in our backyard, the same place where this whole journey began. We've also started talking about starting a family. The events of the past year made us realize life is short and unpredictable. We want to fill our home with love and laughter, to create the family we've always dreamed of. This will be my final update on this situation. Thank you all for your support and advice throughout this journey. It's been a tough road, but we've come out stronger on the other side. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that with honesty, perseverance, and the support of a strong community, you can overcome almost anything. To anyone out there facing a similar situation, don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Your voice matters, and you deserve to feel safe and respected in your own home and community. And remember, sometimes the darkest times can lead to the brightest futures. They certainly did for us.